As we've been discussing, President Trump had many things to say last night, so CBS News fact-checked his speech. CBS News correspondent Michael George is here with more on the claims the president made about the U.S. economy and his record. Great to see you, Michael. Good morning. So, what was true and what was not really on point?
Well, Errol, we've got a lot to break down here. So, in touting his economic accomplishments over the past year, President Trump touched on an issue on the minds of most Americans: inflation.
Inflation has stopped.
Well, CBS News is rating the president's claim that inflation has stopped as false, and I'll tell you why. The Consumer Price Index shows that annual inflation reached 3% in September, which is the most recent month for available data due to the government shutdown. Now, that's a lot lower than the peak it hit under his predecessor, Joe Biden, but this was the same inflation rate as January when President Trump took office. The Federal Reserve's official inflation target.
Camera slowly pans across a dimly lit, nearly empty Congress chamber. Papers rustle on polished wooden desks. The clock on the wall ticks loudly, echoing through the silence. Tonight, history hangs by a thread. Over 100 members of Congress have demanded one thing: impeachment or resignation. And at the center of it all? President Donald Trump. Trump sits alone in a leather chair, pale and tense. His hands shake slightly as he flips through documents. Lawyers whisper urgently nearby, their voices barely audible. Every second feels heavier than the last. This isn't just politics. This is law. Civil contempt, criminal contempt, perjury, each with consequences that could shatter careers, destroy reputations, and alter the course of a nation. One wrong move, and the consequences are immediate. Close up on a wall clock. 4:59 p.m. The minute hand ticks closer to a critical deadline. Trump glances at the clock, eyes narrowing. I can't back down. Not now. A lawyer passes a folder across the table. It contains confidential reports and fact checks, highlighted in red. The words "inflation false claim" stare back at the camera. Another lawyer leans in, whispering urgently, "Sir, Congress is unified. Over 100 members. If we don't act before 5 p.m., Trump's face hardens, sweat forming along his brow. His fingers drum nervously on the table. Outside the chamber, camera flashes from reporters pierce the shadows, capturing every tense heartbeat. A moral battlefield rages within him, loyalty to power or obedience to the law. Every choice carries weight. Every second counts. Clock ticks to 4:59:30 p.m. The air is thick with suspense. A staffer enters, holding another stack of documents, economic claims, inflation stats, fact-check reports. Trump opens one, glancing quickly at the figures. They just can't do this. The camera hovers over the documents. Words like impeachment, resignation, legal penalties flash across the screen in cinematic, dramatic lighting. The clock is ticking, the world is watching, and in less than a minute, everything could change. Clock hits 5:09 p.m. Silence. Then, a faint sound of a gavel. Cut to black. Will he step down, or will the law catch him first? The answer will shock you.
2%, which is a benchmark for ensuring economic growth. Now, let's fact-check another claim President Trump made last night that's related to inflation.
And for the first time in years, wages are rising much faster than inflation.
Well, CBS News is rating the president's claim about wages as partially true. Here's why. In 2023, wages did start to outpace inflation for the first time since 2021. But since then, wage growth has stagnated around 3.5%, while inflation has been steadily rising since falling to a low of 2.3% in April of this year. Now, finally, let's see what the president had to say about health care costs.
The current Unaffordable Care Act was created to make insurance companies rich. It was bad health care at much too high a cost, and you see that now in the steep increase in premiums being demanded by the...
The room was quiet, almost eerily so, as the early morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the House chamber. Over 100 lawmakers had been awake all night, preparing for what many were calling a historic push: impeachment. Their faces were pale, eyes fixed on stacks of documents detailing accusations so severe they could shake the foundations of the presidency: obstruction of justice, abuse of power. Even the word tyranny was etched into official articles. Yet, despite the weight of evidence, the momentum felt fragile, like a rope stretched over a deep canyon. In the center of it all, President Trump remained unshaken, a figure both defiant and isolated. Calls for resignation had poured in from Democrats, Republicans, and even a handful of independents, over 120 lawmakers publicly demanding he step down. 7 senators had voiced similar concerns, but Trump seemed almost untouchable. The documents slid across polished mahogany desks, staffers whispering urgently about inflation claims, wage growth numbers, and the ever-present shadow of the Affordable Care Act. Even as fact-checkers confirmed discrepancies in his speeches, claims about inflation halting, wages outpacing price increases, the president carried on, seemingly indifferent to the mounting calls for accountability. Time was ticking. April 28, 2025 had seen the first of Representative Al Green's resolutions, HRES 353, detailing 7 separate articles of impeachment, each with its own legal reasoning and evidence: obstruction, abuse of trade powers, violation of First Amendment rights, bribery, corruption, and tyranny. The charges read like a catalog of a government under siege. Yet, Republicans controlled the House, and the resolutions were effectively killed without discussion. 2 months later, in June, Green introduced HRES 537, citing abuse of war powers and alleged attempts to shift the nation toward authoritarianism. Again, the resolution was tabled. The machinery of the Constitution existed to check presidential power, but the will to enforce it was missing. Even as public approval ratings plummeted and polls indicated Trump faced his lowest numbers ever, the political shield surrounding him remained unbroken. The 140 votes on December 11th to advance Green's latest articles of impeachment were blocked, a stark reminder that the party's loyalty outweighed institutional responsibility. Republican lawmakers brushed aside claims that Trump was undermining democracy or fomenting violence. Every warning from constitutional experts, every documented charge of authoritarian behavior seemed to vanish into thin air. Inside the chamber, the tension was palpable. Staffers shuffled papers and whispered numbers. 140 votes, blocked. Over 100 lawmakers calling for removal, ignored. Each count underscored a system at odds with itself. Lawmakers who had devoted months to drafting evidence-backed resolutions now faced a stark reality. The tools of accountability existed, but without the cooperation of one party, they were useless. The chamber's silence was deafening, a testament to both procedural power and political paralysis. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly. For those pushing for impeachment, each second felt like a heartbeat closer to either vindication or failure. Every article filed, every vote tallied, every accusation made was a spark of potential action. But without bipartisan will, the sparks fizzled. For the president, the tension appeared almost theatrical. Behind closed doors, aides whispered, legal experts cautioned, but Trump remained steadfast, a man insulated by party loyalty and political inertia. The nation watched as a constitutional mechanism meant to restrain power stumbled, faltering against political realities. The stakes could not have been higher. This wasn't just about one failed impeachment. It was about the future of presidential accountability. Every failed resolution, every ignored call for resignation sent a signal. When a party decides loyalty matters more than law, democracy itself is at risk. And yet, as the day wore on and the sun rose higher, nothing changed. Trump was still in office. The impeachment articles, carefully documented, well-researched, backed by over 100 lawmakers, were shelved once again. The room felt heavier as evening approached, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Members of Congress exchanged grim looks, calls for resignation, procedural warnings, even public outrage. None of it had produced results. The system, designed to check abuses of power, had faltered, and the message was clear. Accusations of tyranny, corruption, and authoritarianism could exist in full public view, and still a president could remain unscathed if his party chose to protect him. And yet, beneath the frustration, beneath the dead-end resolutions, there was a lingering question, one that gnawed at every member of Congress still willing to push forward. How long could this go on before the very foundations of American democracy were tested? Could institutional decay become the new normal? Or would the next vote, the next resolution, finally pierce the wall of loyalty and restore accountability? The answer wasn't coming anytime soon. The president continued to hold power, seemingly untouchable, while over 100 lawmakers' warnings and votes remained frozen in procedural limbo. The stage was set for a year that would test not just political skill, but the resilience of democracy itself. And as the sun set over Washington, the chamber emptied, leaving stacks of unresolved impeachment articles and a nation holding its breath. The morning after the latest blocked impeachment vote, the House chamber felt like a battlefield left in suspended animation. Sunlight streamed through high windows, glinting off papers that still bore the ink of charges labeled tyranny and abuse of power. Lawmakers shuffled through the hallways, faces tight with frustration, whispering to aides about the impossibility of the moment. They had the numbers, they had the evidence, yet the machinery of accountability remained paralyzed by party loyalty. Representative Al Green's office was a whirlwind of activity. Legal briefs lay scattered across every surface, each memo detailing constitutional grounds for removal. HRES 353, HRES 537, and the latest December filings formed a chronological record of what many described as an unprecedented challenge to presidential authority. Staffers and researchers pored over every detail, citing court rulings and historical precedents for impeachment. The Constitution explicitly grants Congress the power to remove a president for high crimes and misdemeanors, yet the practical reality, one deeply entangled with political loyalty, kept these articles from ever reaching the floor. Meanwhile, Trump's political team capitalized on the deadlock. Poll numbers remained low, but the narrative of partisan attacks dominated news cycles. In interviews and social media statements, the president framed every impeachment push as a political witch hunt, turning each legal accusation into a rallying cry for supporters. Over 120 House members had called for resignation, yet public pressure barely registered. The stark contrast between documented charges and the lack of consequence created a surreal backdrop. The president, facing severe accusations, remained firmly in office, shielded by party control. By mid-morning, tension shifted to the Senate. 7 senators had publicly expressed concern over Trump's ability to continue leading, citing the ongoing impeachment filings and constitutional warnings. Discussions about the 25th Amendment gained renewed attention, but the hurdles were immense. The amendment requires a majority of the cabinet to declare a president unable to discharge duties. Then Congress must vote to uphold or overturn that declaration, a 2/3 majority in both chambers. Given the composition of the Senate, such a vote was highly unlikely. Republican unity around Trump ensured that any attempt to invoke the 25th Amendment would falter before it began. As midday approached, the media spotlight intensified. Fact-checkers dissected recent speeches. Claims about inflation stopping were labeled false. Wage growth outpacing inflation was partially true, but stagnating. Assertions about healthcare costs and the Affordable Care Act drew scrutiny. These analyses were more than numbers. They were evidence that many lawmakers cited in their impeachment articles. The juxtaposition was glaring. The president faced clear, documentable contradictions in policy claims, yet remained insulated by political support. In committee rooms, aides quietly debated strategy. "We have over 100 lawmakers in agreement," one whispered, glancing at the growing pile of impeachment evidence. "We've documented abuses, financial misconduct, threats to democratic institutions, and yet, nothing moves." The phrase procedural roadblocks was muttered repeatedly, a euphemism for the political reality. Votes in the House would not pass, resolutions were tabled, and party loyalty outweighed public accountability. The system designed to restrain executive power was faltering under partisan pressure. By late afternoon, the first signs of public tension began to show. Demonstrators gathered outside the Capitol, signs calling for Trump's removal waving in the winter air. Social media campaigns amplified the outrage. Yet the political stalemate persisted. Inside the chamber, lawmakers' eyes darted nervously between colleagues, aware that history was watching. Every ignored warning, every blocked vote added weight to the question. How much erosion of accountability could the system withstand before citizens lost faith in their institutions? The political climate was a tinderbox. Legal experts and constitutional scholars issued warnings about potential authoritarian behavior, noting that sustained obstruction of impeachment undermined the checks and balances meant to protect democracy. Every argument filed, every public call for resignation was met with procedural defenses and party unity strategies, creating a tension between documented evidence and political will. It was a test not only of the president's power, but of the resilience of Congress itself. As evening approached, staffers in Green's office reviewed the growing trail of evidence one more time. The charges were serious: abuse of power, obstruction, violations of constitutional norms, and authoritarian tendencies. Yet the repeated failures of resolutions left lawmakers in an uncomfortable limbo. Would accountability ever prevail, or had partisanship irreversibly weakened one of the core pillars of the Constitution? The questions hung in the air, heavier than the stacks of papers surrounding them, as Washington braced for what could be an unprecedented year in American political history. Night fell over Washington, but the city was far from quiet. In offices across Capitol Hill, lawmakers and aides were still at their desks, lit only by the glow of computer screens and stacks of legal documents. The year's repeated impeachment filings were laid out like a roadmap of institutional failure. Each resolution, April's HRES 353, June's HRES 537, and December's latest, documented serious allegations: obstruction of justice, misuse of trade powers, violations of civil liberties, and tyranny. They weren't symbolic. They were meticulously drafted, grounded in legal precedent, and backed by over 100 lawmakers. Yet time and again, they were blocked before a vote could even occur. Inside the chamber, discussion shifted toward strategy. Green and his team debated how to break through the procedural walls imposed by Republican leadership. "We need to make the case undeniable," one aide said, scanning through the pile of documents highlighting the president's contradictory statements on inflation, wage growth, and healthcare costs. Every piece of fact-checked evidence, every economic discrepancy was a potential weapon, but the political shield around Trump remained formidable. Even the most damning legal evidence risked being ignored if it threatened party unity. Meanwhile, across Pennsylvania Avenue, Trump's legal advisors and campaign strategists were not idle. They dissected every resolution, every public statement, every vote, plotting ways to frame the impeachment efforts as partisan attacks. Press briefings, interviews, and social media posts were coordinated with military precision. Public messaging emphasized loyalty, stability, and framing critics as destabilizing forces. The effect was clear. While Congress debated legality and procedure, Trump maintained control over the narrative, reinforcing his political shield and further complicating lawmakers' efforts to hold him accountable. The Senate, too, became a focal point of tension. 7 senators had spoken publicly about the president's potential unfitness for office, invoking concerns about constitutional duties and the 25th Amendment. Legal scholars in Washington noted the difficulty. Removing a sitting president through the amendment required a majority of the cabinet to act and a 2/3 majority in both chambers to confirm. With loyalists controlling key positions, the likelihood of success was slim. Every legal avenue Congress had to intervene was constrained by the realities of political allegiance, not the severity of the charges. Public scrutiny intensified as the impeachment process, or lack thereof, made headlines. Citizens and media outlets followed the saga closely, noting the disconnect between the documented charges and the lack of consequences. The president's approval ratings reflected public unease, yet political loyalty continued to outweigh accountability. Demonstrations outside the Capitol grew louder, social media amplified calls for action, and opinion pieces repeatedly questioned whether the mechanisms of government could still enforce checks and balances. Still, in the halls of power, party cohesion prevailed. By late evening, Green's office prepared a detailed report for the next day's discussions, a timeline of impeachment attempts, analysis of blocked votes, and summaries of public and congressional responses. Each entry highlighted a growing concern. When a president faces sustained, credible accusations but remains shielded by party loyalty, the principle of accountability erodes. The Constitution's safeguards were being tested in real time, and the stakes could not have been higher. Lawmakers left for the night with heavy hearts, fully aware that every moment Trump remained in office under these allegations increased the pressure on the system itself. Democracy's usual rhythms, debate, voting, oversight, were being replaced by strategic procedural maneuvers and partisan defense. Yet, the following day would bring new developments as lawmakers continued to strategize, press their case publicly, and search for a path forward that could finally restore accountability. The tension was palpable. Could the system correct itself before the accumulation of unchecked power became irreversible? As Washington slept, the questions lingered. How far could the president go before the party's loyalty faltered? Would the impeachment process regain its force, or had it been rendered ceremonial, an exercise in futility? And in the background of every blocked vote and procedural hurdle, the nation waited, watching democracy's test unfold, unaware of how close the constitutional machinery had come to losing its balance entirely. The next morning, the corridors of Congress were buzzing with a mixture of urgency and frustration. Lawmakers huddled in small groups, whispering updates and reviewing the latest legal analyses. The sheer volume of impeachment articles filed by Representative Al Green, April, June, and December, was staggering. Each article represented a calculated legal argument, backed by historical precedent and meticulous documentation of presidential misconduct. Yet the pattern was all too familiar. Procedural roadblocks, partisan loyalty, and stalled votes kept them from ever reaching the floor for debate. In committee rooms, aides scrolled through the most recent fact checks on the president's speeches. Inflation hadn't stopped, wage growth was stagnating, healthcare costs remained high, and every claim had been scrutinized. This evidence was central to Green's arguments. If the president misrepresented key economic facts while allegedly abusing power, it strengthened the legal case for removal. But the political reality made even the most compelling evidence almost irrelevant. One staffer muttered, "It's like shouting facts into a hurricane. Nothing lands." Meanwhile, across the hall, Republican leadership strategized. Their priority was clear: maintain party unity and prevent any impeachment vote from advancing. Every attempt to schedule a debate, to force a procedural vote, was systematically blocked. Public statements framed impeachment as partisan theater, distracting from real issues. Media narratives became a battlefield, with each side attempting to shape public perception. For the president, the strategy was working. Loyalty, narrative control, and procedural dominance allowed him to remain insulated from the growing chorus of accusations. By mid-afternoon, Green's team turned their attention to the Senate. 7 senators had voiced concerns about the president's fitness for office and even hinted at the 25th Amendment. Legal scholars warned that invoking it would be extremely difficult. It required both a majority of cabinet members and a 2/3 congressional vote to remove the president. Yet, the discussion itself underscored the severity of the situation. The system designed to check presidential power had options, but political dynamics made those options nearly impossible to exercise. Outside the Capitol, public demonstrations grew louder. Citizens carried signs demanding accountability and removal, while social media amplified the call for impeachment. Polls reflected growing concern over the president's handling of the economy and governance, yet political mechanisms within Congress remained immovable. Even with 140 votes to advance the December impeachment articles, Republican procedural tactics ensured the resolution was tabled without debate. The dissonance between public outrage, documented evidence, and congressional inaction created a tense atmosphere. In Green's office, the mood was one of calculated urgency. Staffers reviewed timelines, cross-referenced prior filings, and prepared for the next round of hearings. They knew that each blocked vote and ignored call for resignation eroded not just immediate accountability, but the long-term credibility of the institution itself. Democracy's usual safeguards, debate, oversight, voting, were being replaced by a rigid defense of party loyalty, leaving lawmakers and citizens alike questioning whether the system could still function effectively. As evening approached, Capitol Hill seemed suspended in anticipation. The president remained in office, protected by unwavering partisan support. The questions loomed larger than ever. How long could this stalemate continue? Could procedural roadblocks and party loyalty permanently weaken the checks on executive power? And what would it take, if anything, for accountability to finally assert itself? For the lawmakers pushing for impeachment, the answers remained unclear. Every resolution, every vote, every public call for resignation reinforced the same lesson. The system worked on paper, but in practice, loyalty and procedure often outweighed evidence and law. As night fell once more, the Capitol lights cast long shadows over stacks of unresolved impeachment articles, leaving a stark reminder that America's constitutional safeguards were under their most serious test in decades. As the sun rose the following day, the Capitol buzzed with an uneasy energy. The impeachment resolutions had become more than legal documents. They were symbols of a system struggling to function. Green's team meticulously reviewed the December filing once again, analyzing every allegation, promoting violence, undermining democratic norms, misusing executive power, and pushing the country toward authoritarianism. Each claim was substantiated with references to prior actions, speeches, and factual discrepancies, yet the political reality remained unyielding. In a quiet hallway, a senior aide reflected on the irony. "We have evidence, votes, and public support," they whispered. Yet nothing happens. It's like the system exists in theory, but in practice, it's paralyzed by loyalty. Across the floor, Republican leadership framed impeachment as partisan theatrics, emphasizing the danger of disrupting governmental stability. By controlling procedural pathways, they ensured that even well-supported resolutions never reached meaningful debate, maintaining a shield around the president that no legal argument could penetrate. Meanwhile, Trump's team capitalized on the gridlock. Every blocked resolution, every stalled vote became proof of his supporters' loyalty. Public messaging highlighted stability and party cohesion while portraying impeachment as baseless attacks. The president's narrative dominated the news cycle, effectively neutralizing evidence-based arguments by reframing them as partisan smears. Analysts noted that while public opinion reflected concern, political mechanisms within Congress insulated the president, making removal unlikely despite documented misconduct. By mid-morning, attention turned back to the Senate and the 25th Amendment. 7 senators had signaled concern about the president's fitness, but political realities made action almost impossible. Cabinet members loyal to Trump were unlikely to invoke the amendment, and even if they did, securing a 2/3 vote in both chambers to remove him was a near impossible task. Every legal and constitutional pathway toward accountability faced significant barriers, highlighting the tension between theory and practice in American governance. Outside the Capitol, demonstrations escalated. Crowds gathered, demanding resignation and accountability, while social media amplified calls for removal. Citizens debated in real time whether Congress could act or if political obstruction had rendered constitutional safeguards impotent. The disconnect between documented abuses and political inaction created a growing sense of disillusionment. Public pressure, which would have previously influenced political decision-making, seemed powerless against entrenched party loyalty and procedural manipulation. By afternoon, Green convened a strategy meeting with senior aides and legal advisors. They examined every past impeachment attempt, weighing procedural lessons against legal and public strategies. "We have over 100 lawmakers supporting removal," one aide said. "We have votes to advance articles, and yet we're blocked. What's the point if the system keeps failing?" The group acknowledged that while their efforts were substantial and legally grounded, party cohesion continued to undermine the checks and balances meant to protect the nation from executive overreach. As the day drew to a close, Capitol Hill seemed suspended between two realities: a president accused of tyranny and misconduct, and a political system constrained by party loyalty. The evidence was compelling, the public concerned, and lawmakers committed, but structural and political barriers ensured the stalemate would continue. For Green and his team, each blocked vote was not just a political defeat, it was a warning about the fragility of democratic accountability. Even as night settled over Washington, the stakes remained high. Citizens watched, lawmakers planned, and the president maintained control. The question hanging in the air was stark. Could the system restore accountability, or had partisan loyalty permanently weakened the constitutional mechanisms designed to check presidential power? Every unresolved impeachment, every ignored resignation call intensified the tension, and the nation held its breath, waiting to see if democracy itself could withstand the pressure. The following morning brought a new wave of tension to Capitol Hill. Lawmakers arrived early, aware that every hour without action added to the weight of the crisis. Green's office was filled with aides and legal advisors reviewing the timeline of failed impeachment attempts: April, June, and December filings. Each resolution highlighted serious allegations, yet procedural roadblocks and party loyalty repeatedly stifled them. The room hummed with frustration. Evidence and votes existed, but the political will to act remained absent. By mid-morning, the focus shifted to public messaging. Social media campaigns and press briefings amplified calls for accountability, emphasizing the charges of tyranny, abuse of power, and threats to democracy. Yet even as millions watched, Republican leadership controlled the procedural levers, framing impeachment as partisan theater. Every blocked vote reinforced the perception that, despite documented misconduct, the president's allies would protect him at all costs. The stark contrast between facts and action created an almost surreal political climate. Meanwhile, legal experts and constitutional scholars were increasingly vocal. They highlighted the unprecedented nature of over 100 lawmakers calling for removal while a party blocks every path to accountability. The discussions in think tanks and law schools mirrored the anxiety in Congress. If a president could accumulate serious, verified accusations without facing consequences, what precedent was being set for future leaders? Democracy's safeguards seemed at risk, not from a single individual, but from the structural choice to prioritize party loyalty over constitutional duty. By afternoon, the Senate again became a point of focus. 7 senators had expressed concern about Trump's fitness, citing the 25th Amendment as a possible avenue for removal. Yet political realities made the action improbable. Cabinet members loyal to the president were unlikely to declare him unfit, and even if they did, achieving a 2/3 vote in both chambers remained virtually impossible. The theoretical tools of accountability existed, but the practical barriers highlighted a system struggling to reconcile law with political reality. Across the city, protests intensified. Demonstrators called for resignation, shouting into the cold winter air, while media outlets dissected every speech, every vote, and every procedural move. Fact checks on economic statements, healthcare claims, and executive actions were woven into narratives of constitutional risk. Yet, inside Congress, political calculus often outweighed legal documentation, leaving the public frustrated and increasingly skeptical about whether the government could enforce checks and balances effectively. As evening approached, Green's team held a critical meeting. They reviewed the accumulation of evidence and procedural lessons, weighing strategies to break through the political deadlock. "We've documented everything," an aide emphasized. "We have votes and public support, but the system won't act. If loyalty keeps outweighing law, what does that say about our institutions?" The question hung in the room like a shadow. Every blocked vote, every ignored call for resignation, underscored the fragility of accountability and the vulnerability of democratic processes. By nightfall, the Capitol was eerily quiet, yet the tension persisted. Every unresolved impeachment, every procedural block, reinforced the sense that the system was caught between legal theory and political reality. The president remained in office, protected by party cohesion and procedural control, while lawmakers and citizens alike faced the stark realization that accountability mechanisms could fail when political loyalty trumped constitutional duty. The stage was set for the next escalation, and the nation held its breath. Would this stalemate continue indefinitely, or was there a breaking point approaching, one that could finally restore the balance of power? The following week brought a heightened sense of urgency to Capitol Hill. Green's office was a flurry of activity, with aides cross-referencing every previous filing, reviewing floor votes, and updating legal briefs. December's impeachment resolution, arguably the most serious yet, was at the center of attention. Its charges were stark, promoting violence, undermining democratic institutions, violating constitutional norms, and steering the country toward authoritarianism. Yet, as had become a pattern, procedural maneuvers threatened to block its progress before debate could even begin.